Probably the main thing I've written is don't underestimate finger and hand injuries. Like the classic for us as physios is they'll come in with their hamstring from the weekend and they'll say, oh, by the way, I did this to my finger, and you look at it and you're more worried about the finger than the hamstring. So don't underestimate, just because it's a small bone or a small area, they can be really serious injuries and they can have long-term consequences, particularly for these guys' work if they do damage to their hands. You know, a lot of these guys are tradies or use their hands at work, so they need to look after them, which means they need to manage any sort of injuries properly. All dislocations and subluxations should be x-rayed. It doesn't matter where it is in the body, and fingers is the same. So whether it's been relocated by a medical person or it's been relocated in hospital, they'll always x-ray them in hospital, and it's really important that you do, simply because there's a few guidelines for finger fracture that can happen from dislocation, and you're not going to know unless you x-ray. If there's a fracture inside any of the joints in your finger that's more than a third of the surface, that's an indication they probably should have surgery because the outcomes aren't good. So you're only going to know that with an x-ray. If the piece of bone that you've fractured is into the joint and it's on the palm side, so the fracture's gone onto the palm side, again that's a good indication they're probably going to need a little pin put in it. But you're not going to know those things by looking at a finger. This is why I'm saying to you they need to be x-rayed. These footballers will say, no, it's nothing, I don't need to do it. And I know you can't walk them into the hospital, but just try and be really firm with them and say, you should get this x-ray, particularly, and just make it about their work and other stuff in life, not about their football, because that's the really important stuff, I think. So I'd say that to you to start off with. So all fractures and dislocations and subluxations should be, all dislocations and subluxations should be x-rayed. Fractures are a little bit more obvious, obviously, a lot of the time, and particularly where there's deformity, when you can see them. So obviously they need to be fractured, and then an assessment on how they should be managed, preferably by a doctor most of the time, or an orthopaedic surgeon, because it depends on where they're fractured. So if you're fractured down in your metacarpal, a lot of the time they'll just leave them. They won't actually do surgery on it. If you fracture a little piece of bone inside your joint up here, quite often they'll put a pin in it if it's gone the wrong way. So again, the size of it doesn't actually reflect how they'll manage these injuries, and that's the important thing to know. It doesn't have to be this massive, great big lump in the hand with a bone sticking out for it to get a pin in it or to be repaired. Because the thing about the finger particularly, and it's a really complex and specialised area, there's lots of tendon attachments and ligament attachments here, and sometimes they can pull a piece of bone off as well. So sometimes if you have a tendon injury to what's called a central slip in your finger, you can lose the ability to be able to actually extend your finger. So we see people that have come to us a couple of weeks later and they go, I just can't straighten my finger anymore. And they've lost that central slip. Well, they need to be braced early on for 2 to 4 weeks so that it's got a chance to repair, so then they can eventually do that full movement. And those kind of things can only be really assessed properly once, by either a physio or a hand OT or a hand physio or a doctor. So that's what I'd say to you about all those things, is don't underestimate them. You can get damage to the ligaments on each of the joints. You can get damage to the ligaments around the thumbs, pretty common in footy as well. Fractures in the thumb are reasonably common. Most people around me footy for a long time. And again, some of those need surgery, and some of those you can get away with bracing. And again, it's knowing which ones you can and which ones you can't. Central slip injuries I've talked about. Conservative management, just going on to management, most of the time, a lot of these can be, when I say surgery, not all, a small percentage of them need surgery, it's just not missing that small percentage that's the issue. But most of them are managed with bracing, taping, rest, ice, compression, and then eventually massage and stuff to get them going. So most injuries are managed like that. Coband's great for finger injuries, wrapping Coban around as a compression, because it actually expands, so if your finger's still swelling, obviously not put it on too tight, but Coban works really, really well. So you can't go wrong putting them into some Coban to send them to the hospital or whatever, because again, they can unwrap it at hospital, get their x-ray, wrap it back on. It's really easy to use like that, so Coban's a great compression. Icing hands is easy. Get a bucket of water, put a whole heap of icicles in it, hand straight in, or a ice cream container. Works really well. You can put an ice pack over the top, but to be honest, that works really well. Is to put their hand in ice water, similar to what we do with ankles. That's a good way to ice their hand as well.
If you just go backward,
yeah.
You're talking about the things. Lots of very laid back with the things. We just put in this little injury, but of course the tendon can go,
yeah.
and you won't be able to detect the code. It might not be that part,
yeah.
and it'll look quite normal. But anything that's out, I usually chip them out. If it's not,
They need to get X-rayed.
well, see you guys can do the X-ray too, can't you?
We can refer for an X-ray.
That's
That's fine.
here.
And we've got the connections to be able to send them to an ortho really quickly, hopefully,
Exactly.
to get that dealt with as well. So if the X-ray comes back, and we're aware of usually what needs to be referred off. So if it comes back a bit suspect, we'll send it to someone pretty quickly.
And they'll be right next point.
Yeah, exactly.
Just on the ice,
Yeah.
is there any benefit to keep that ice going, say a month, 6 weeks after, if they're still having pain?
If there's swelling, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, if there's swelling, but like most of the time, most of the swelling, majority of the time is settled down by then. But if there is, yeah, absolutely. I've no problems with using ice, even in some of my, even we suggest when they're coming back running after a hamstring injury, they might want to still ice after they do a running session, just as a precaution more than anything. But I think ice is the most underused thing, and I think it's great. Yeah, absolutely.
Can I just say also that by underestimating that finger, we've seen some where the actual insertion has been around right up to here, and pins put through, and that can be a real mess, just that little pinky, that much of it. So if it looks like it's not bending within the week.
And I'm more worried about these guys, not so much with their football careers up here, I'm more worried
It's their
about
life,
their
it's their
lifestyle
exactly.
stuff. So, and look, the other thing is obviously if they do need some sort of significant amount of bracing or taping, or they have surgery, they're going to need to strengthen their hand back up. So that's where they need to get some good advice and some exercises to strengthen their hand back up afterwards. Hands waste really quickly. I don't know whether you've seen footballers that have had, or people that have had surgery on their hands, particularly around thumbs. Like this muscle in your thumb disappears just about overnight. It's an amazing area that loses muscle really quickly. So there's all sorts of tools you can use these days, like squeezy balls and nets that you can squeeze and all sorts of stuff that we've got accessibility to. So those kind of strengthening exercises, once they're allowed to, if they've had surgery or once they're out of their bracing period, and typically bracing for hands and fingers will be somewhere between 2 and 6 weeks. So it's not, you're not talking about an insignificant amount of time as well. Taping them, you can tape them when they're coming back to footy if the player wants that, no issues with that at all. Once they've been cleared and everything's healed and maybe gone through the bracing period or they've had surgery and they're coming back into footy, taping's not an issue there at all. So that's another option through all that. I could go through each of the hand injuries, but it's just not, there's no point in that really. I think the big thing is to take out of it, don't underestimate them. Make sure they get an X-ray if they've subluxed or dislocated their finger or their hand in any way, or their thumb. And just make sure that they get some sort of good assessment, particularly if it looks like it's going to be ongoing or if they're in severe pain. So it's really, really important to do that. Any questions about hands and fingers that you wanted specifically? Because you guys, again, see them all the time.
What about, like, if we're sort of playing locally and we've got access to be able to refer someone off and they can be seen in, half an hour or whatever, leave their dislocation alone. If you're remote, and say you're 2 hours from somewhere, and your player's in a lot of pain, realistically, what do you do?
You may not even be able to get that joint back in until I've had instances with shoulders and stuff, they can't get the joint in even in hospital, they have to knock the person out to get it in.
Yeah.
So you may not be able to get it in anyway, is the first thing that I'd say to you. Call an ambulance, get them on some good pain medication. That's probably my advice to you is, they can get, they call those green whistle things, there's an ammo. Those good old